Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 234 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you were to browse my bookshelf at home, you'd find a whole lot of books that look like they haven't actually been read. I like to keep my books neat and clean, so when I come back to them, it's like they're fresh and new. But the best loved of all my books inevitably have creases and maybe even a little spot from a flick of spaghetti sauce, leaving a tangible record of when and how I used them. No matter how anonymous I'd like to be, the book holds a memory of me in its pages. The same is also true, of course, of medieval manuscripts, which can be famously dirty and well-loved, and tell us a whole lot about the people who used them and how they used them. This week, I spoke with Dr. Kate Rudy and got the dirt on medieval books. Kate is the Bishop Wardlaw Professor in the School of Art History at St. Andrews University, the winner of the Walter Scott Medal, and the author of a whole bunch of books, including Postcards on Parchment, The Social Lives of Medieval Books, Piety in Pieces, How Medieval Readers Customized Their Manuscripts, and Image, Knife, and Glue Pot, Early Assemblage in Manuscript and Print. Her new book is Touching Parchment, How Medieval Users Rubbed, Handled, and Kissed Their Manuscripts, Volume 1, Officials and Their Books. Our conversation on how people used and abused their books, what we can learn from the smudges they left behind, and why we should all appreciate a really dirty book is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Kate, for joining me to talk about dirty books. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
It's great to be here, Danielle. I love being here, and you're such an inspiration. Love your podcast.
Oh my gosh, that's so nice. I didn't even pay this woman. All right. So we can say without any sort of qualifications that you love dirty books, right? What kind of dirty books do you love?
I really do. So back when I was curator, I used to be curator of illuminated manuscripts at the Royal Library in the Netherlands. And being a curator is really a special kind of beast because you get access to the whole collection and all the filthy stuff and, boxes and boxes of things. And you just get curious and open them all up and wonder what's inside. And I mean, for years, the kinds of things that scholars and curators generally have put in books and in exhibition catalogs and put out in vitrines for exhibitions tend to be the shiny and the pristine and the things with the great provenance and the things that are connected by touch to this or that king or duke. But actually, what really fills the shelves of medieval manuscript repositories are the filth, the abject, the really handled. And so I took a sort of liking to those things and realized that actually they have a lot to tell us about what people did and thought and felt in the past. And so that's really been what I've tried to pursue over the last 20 some years.
Oh, I can't even imagine how much fun that must have been to just pick up these books and look at them and see how people were using them. So you talked just a little bit in volume 1 of your series about figuring out how people were touching things and actually starting to analyze how much people have touched things. Can you tell us a little bit about how the ways that you do that have evolved over the years? Because I think you said sort of at the beginning of your career, people weren't really sure how to figure out what people were doing with these books. And this is a field that has evolved. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So actually the story really starts when I was 7 years old and I lived in Massachusetts and my mother took me to the Boston Museum of Science. And this was like the most important day of my career. And I was 7 and I watched the little birds, little chickens hatch from their shells under these warm lights. I mean, they're the kind of lights that we now associate with keeping French fries warm, but they're good for chickens as well. And the chickens have their little beaks and they're trying to peck their way out of their shells. And as a 7-year-old Kate stood there and rooting for my favorite chicken, you can do it. And when they get out of their shells, they're all wet and look horrible. And then they shake off and they're all fluffy things. But I stood there for a really, really long time. It completely absorbed me until a guard came over and said, "Hey, kid, we're closing. You got to go now." And he said, But you can look down at the floor, he said to me, and see that the floor has been all cracked and used because other kids also really like this exhibition. I think he was just trying to make me feel like not too weird about the fact that I just spent the better part of the afternoon with these chickens. And that was my first exposure to the idea of indirect measurement, that you could look at the floor tiles around this chicken exhibition and see that they were more worn than other exhibitions. They'd been replaced a couple times and so forth. And that from that, we could just measure the intensity of the desire to stand there and look at that. And that idea really followed me to my curatorship. And then looking at hundreds of books of ours, I've probably looked through, I don't know, thousands. I have more than 15,000 pages of notes on my computer from touch typing my notes over the years. And I'm noticing something about books of ours, which is that some pages are really dirty and some pages are really clean. And those dirty pages must index the amount of time that people spent handling those particular pages. And so as curator, I took one particular little Delft manuscript from about 1440 that had a really filthy opening at the suffrages of Saint Sebastian. And then other sections were really clean. And I sent the book down to the photographer studio and I said, hey, could you photograph every single folio of this manuscript under constant light conditions and same f-stop, same exposure, everything, and then print them all out. And I'm going to arrange them in my office from lightest to darkest. And so I made this request. And then the photographer came marching up to my office and said, why do you want us to do all this work? And I explained, and he said, well, we have a machine here, which is called a densitometer, which is what we use to measure the optical density of microfilm so we know how to set the microfilm reader when we're making a printout of it. And maybe this little gizmo will do the trick. And so I tried it and it worked a charm. And so I set the densitometer on every folio of the manuscript and took a reading, logged those readings into a spreadsheet, and then was able to generate a graph that showed the intensity of handling for each of the sections of the book. And in that particular manuscript, the end of the manuscript, the last couple of quires, had been added by a later user. And which is interesting because they were full of indulgences. And the reader who added those things, that's really what they wanted to read. And you could see the degree of the fingerprints on that part of the book, that added bit. And then this person also, desperately read the suffrages to Saint Sebastian. You could imagine that here's a person who's very afraid of the plague, for whom, this Saint Sebastian might be a useful intervener. And this person also read the beginnings up to Vespers of the Hours of the Cross, and then interest petered out considerably, according to this graph. And so I realized that this might be an interesting way to see how people actually read, what they were interested in, what they wanted to read more of. And so I did it to a whole bunch of other manuscripts too, both in the Royal Library, and then I went off to Berlin. Berlin were kind enough at that time to give me an office, a big stack of manuscripts, and an assistant to help me do the recording. And so that helped immensely. And so that was the sort of beginning. That was the Dirty Books project that I wrote up, more than 10 years ago now, that started this off. And then since then, I've been thinking about other kinds of manuscripts and larger manuscripts for which densitometry doesn't really work. Because with densitometry, you have to hold the book open continuously. And that only really works for small octavo-sized manuscripts. But for large manuscripts that sit on a lectern, the reader or user might just touch it briefly to turn the page, but then it lies there on the lectern untouched. And the reader might grab it at a different spot each time. And so the amount of dirt ground into the bottom corner isn't necessarily going to index interest on that particular page. So I had to come up with some different ways to measure that.
I think that's fascinating. And I love it when medievalists talk to people in other departments. And come up with these creative solutions that just make life easier for everyone and just open all sorts of doors. So I love that story. That's perfect. So we're talking about grime, especially on the corners of these pages. And this is something that you call inadvertent touching. And this is something that is different from deliberate sort of touching. I'm trying to remember the word that you use, from targeted wear. So can you tell us the difference between inadvertent and targeted wear on a manuscript?
Yes. So, okay, inadvertent wear is wear and tear that just happens in the course of normal handling of a manuscript. So holding it open it will deposit skin and dirt and so forth, mostly in the lower corners. But other kinds of inadvertent wear might occur when a reader is using the manuscript with a candle, and that candle is tipped or it splashes and a bit of wax gets splashed onto the manuscript because of reading it with candlelight. Or if a reader takes a book outside and processes it either maybe an Easter procession or at a graveside, for example, and it gets rained on. And you can see where rain falls on a manuscript, an open manuscript, and the entire thing becomes buckled and pockmarked, and some of the pigment loosens itself from the page. And then the page itself, if it's parchment, it gets gummy. And then when it dries, it gets kind of tight and stiff. And so you can hear and feel the difference of a manuscript opening that has been exposed to all over water. And you can also see when wax has spilled on a manuscript and then reverse engineer how that might have happened. Say, this is from a candle. But there might also be wax in a manuscript that could be targeted wear. And so it's not necessarily that, water or wax is always inadvertent. But for example, in the Bodleian, there is a commentary, Augustine's commentary on the Psalms that was made in Reading Abbey. And what's interesting about that is that it was probably used to read aloud at collation. And somebody has put little drops of wax in the margin that might correspond to where the reading should pick up next time. And then they're scraped out with what you can see as a fingernail. So it's as if the wax in that case is being used as a kind of post-it note that, can change position in the margin as you proceed. But otherwise, the kinds of targeted wear that I'm very interested in as an art historian is to think about how people touched particular images or even touched decoration or letters or text in a very purposeful way, quite physically, with their bodies, with their fingers. And they do that for a whole variety of reasons. And so I've made a diagram that shows some of the motivations behind these forms of targeted wear.
And in the broad categories on this chart, the chart, must have taken a whole lot of thinking to figure out. On this chart, you have basically two categories: people who are touching the book in a certain way because they like it, and people who are touching it in a certain way because they don't like it. They don't like the image or something like that. What do you find most often, that people are touching a book because they venerate it, or are you finding more often people are being unkind to the book and scratching things?
Oh, that's really interesting. So in the past, catalogers often called all kinds of damage iconoclasm. So everything gets chalked up to iconoclasm. But I think that is a misnomer. And there are different kinds of attacking of images for different kinds of motivations. So you might attack it ideologically after the reforms in England, for example, where you might attack the image of St. Thomas because you were told to. And that's one kind of attacking of images. Another kind might be if there's an image of a martyrdom of a saint, and you are really into the narrative of this martyrdom, and you want to stick up for the saint. So you get in there and scratch out the feet or the hands or the eyes of the antagonist in the image. And that's an entirely different motivation from being ideologically opposed to image making itself or opposed to a particular saint like Thomas. But I have mostly been looking, I've really concentrated on looking for places in manuscripts that have been venerated and where people are either venerating particular images by kissing them. And for those instances, we can often see where somebody brings the book close to the face and gives it a big smooch because their nose grease and whatever they had for lunch and, greasy gravy or delicious medieval butter or whatever it is, seeps through the lipidinous parchment and it results in a dark stain on the back. And then the saliva itself, which is water soluble, it loosens the water soluble paint. And so if somebody kisses, say, the foot of the cross, then their nose grease might darken a spot near the cross itself, while their saliva might also loosen a gob of paint. And what's interesting about that is that when the book then closes, that gob of paint often then migrates to the other side of the opening. And so I see that a lot, which is why I think it's really useful to photograph entire openings rather than photographing a single image in isolation. And I think one of the reasons that it's become possible to do this kind of study is because making digital images is now in our hands, and we can take little documentary images along the way. I've made close to 1 million of them. And that when I do so, I always photograph the image in its bookish context to better understand the mechanics of the entire gesture of this kiss and how it might result in goopy paint and gets, transferred to the other side. And then also photograph the back of the folio to see if, is there some nose grease that's seeped through the page, like the quicker picker-upper? That's a reference to a Bounty towel ad from my youth.
It's true.
So yes. So lots of veneration and lots of really physical engagement that I think it's possible to reverse engineer. And on that note, it's interesting to see, and I think it's possible to see, the really huge difference between one person who owns a book who touches an image again and again and again the same way, touching it, and then wearing a hole from that kind of habit, from that habituated set of gestures, wearing a hole on the face of Mary, for example, or licking off her entire gown. Whereas when many people touch a single image, each one touches slightly differently. And so there are lots of civic manuscripts. So one I feature in volume 1 is called the Red Privilege Book, which was made for the city of 's-Hertogenbosch. And it has all of the laws and statutes and privileges. And it was used also for the various magistrates to swear their allegiance to the rules and to each other every year. And you can see that the handprints that have been smeared onto the image of the crucifixion come from every direction, and they don't resemble at all the concentrated, targeted wear of a single person venerating. So one person venerating many, many times is very different from many people venerating once each, is what I'm trying to say.
And what I love about this, something that you pointed out, is that artists, maybe getting tired of their artwork getting smeared everywhere, started to make targets for you to actually kiss the manuscript. Like, don't kiss Jesus's face. You're going to make it run. Why don't you kiss this spot instead?
Exactly. Yes. Yes. What I like to call an osculatory target, because it sounds very official. the little cross at the bottom of the page. And about half of those are, in fact, kissed and smeared. And you can see that they have been. But sometimes, especially priests who have images of Christ crucified as a missal that faces the canon of the Mass, that priests often say, nah, I really want to kiss the actual feet or the actual torso. And they completely ignore the osculatory target.
Right. So this brings me to the question. One of the things you're looking at in this book is, can we figure out what people's rituals were. So can you tell us what were some of these targets when people are kissing a manuscript in maybe a service or something, or they're swearing on something? What are they going for in the manuscript?
Yes, yes, I love that question. So, okay, let me give you an example. So I'll paint an image here because people don't have the images in front of them. Although the book is free and you can download it for free and all the images are there, so you can look along. But figures 12 through 15 are from the Schnutgen Museum in Cologne, and it is a gospel manuscript from the 9th century. And like a lot of other gospel manuscripts, at the beginnings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is an author portrait. And gospel manuscripts are often used for swearing oaths. And in this particular example, what's interesting is that the opening at Matthew is completely clean and looks unscathed. Parchment is quite crisp and clean. But when you turn to Mark, there's a great big juicy handprint right below the author portrait of Mark as he is sitting there with his own hand on his own gospel manuscript and his author portrait. And then again with Luke, we see not only a big handprint under the author portrait, but also one in the corner of the facing folio, as if two people have their hands on the book and they're doing some kind of swearing oath together. And same with John. And then under John, we get the darkest, largest handprint. So that seems to be the opening that people prefer when they are doing this swearing ritual. And I've postulated in the book that Matthew is completely clean because there is an injunction in Matthew against swearing. It says, do not swear oaths, period. And so people said, oh, well, we'll swear oaths, but just not on the book of Matthew.
Yeah, that's
but
awkward.
John is really awkward. But John is far away and fair game. And especially the first 14 lines of John, which have all these apotropaic benefits. And so people are cozying up to that with their bodies and swearing their oaths on that. And what I found, and actually this isn't in the book, this is in a separate article. Can I tell you about this too?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. So I think that like, private people who wanted to swear oaths, who wouldn't necessarily have a gospel manuscript handy because those were kept in churches, they weren't generally owned by the public, but would want to swear on something. And we can read about these kinds of swearing rituals in various Chaucerian stories, for example, and elsewhere, where people will just make do with the books that they have. So it might be a prayer book or a psalter or something like that. But my hypothesis is that people often use the gospel periocopes that are written at the beginnings of lots of French books of hours for this purpose. And they lay their hands, especially on the image of John that is often prefaces the gospel pericopes in their books of hours. And if they don't have one of those, then another thing that they can swear on is the image of Christ crucified, which almost always prefaces the hours of the cross. And so that's very much like the kind of image that would be in a missal at the canon. Or they can swear on an image of Christ as judge, which increasingly becomes the iconography that prefaces the 7 penitential psalms. And so in lots of books of hours, those particular subjects have been severely targeted for wear. And so my hypothesis is, in fact, that people could use those things in their private prayer books for swearing oaths of the sort of swearing that they would have seen taking place at altars or in these public fora. And so actually that is one of the big hypotheses or the big arguments in all 4 volumes is that people who are in public office or have public roles, priests, judges, teachers, and so forth, who, for lack of a better word, manhandle their books publicly, when they do so, they are also teaching these ways of handling books to others who are watching. And those private people who might have prayer books then exert those same kinds of rituals on their prayer books. So we get a kind of migration from high to low of these gestures from people in authority down to owners of private prayer books.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I might have drifted from your question.
No, I love it. Any information is good information. Well, I just wanted to tell the people one of the things that you mentioned in the book that I think is great is people are kissing the Gospels when they're showing that they're serious about something, including witnesses, which is something that you bring up until the 19th century when the doctors are like, stop kissing the Gospels. It's gross. You're going to get sick. Just lay your hand on it. It's fine.
Exactly.
So I love that. As soon as germ theory comes up, they're like, no, stop kissing the Gospels because that's gross. But I didn't realize that touching the Gospels as a way of swearing to tell the truth was as far back as Justinian, like saying actually it should be the Gospels that you're using because not everyone has a relic. So as you say, it's easy to use a prayer book that, a lot of people will have or have access to or to touch across that you see. It's a lot easier than trying to dig up a relic from somewhere. So anyway, I just thought that as soon as germ theory came along, people were mentioning stop kissing the Gospels.
Exactly. It takes Louis Pasteur to break some religious habits.
Yeah, you can imagine. With all the nose grease, it's it's getting pretty gross to kiss that gospel. One of the things I found really interesting in the book was that there's a lot of wear that you talk about where people are swearing an oath, for example, and you can see that the book has been gripped from the bottom so that it's facing the person who's asking for the oath and it's being touched from the top. Can you tell me about this? Because I think this is really fascinating. The fact that it's oriented not towards the person who's swearing, but towards the person who's asking for this oath.
Yes, that's a great question. So in Agen, for example, we have a customs book from Agen that has a 2-page spread at the beginning of it. And the imagery is borrowed from a missal. And in this case, you can also see that there are handprints, big fingerprints at the bottoms of the opening where an official has gripped the book and then thrust it at somebody who is going to swear maybe an oath of allegiance to the city and has then reached into the book, which is why we get wear at the bottom and also wear in the center of the picture. So that's just a way of trying to think about reverse engineering these patterns of wear. I think one way of helping to reverse engineer this is to print out the images and make a little mock-up that's physical and then try this with friends at a dinner party or just if I hold this book out and you stick your hands in, what happens? Or where do your hands land? And so making a little paper duplicate is useful for thinking about the mechanics of how these social arrangements take place.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about the different ways that people are handling books because you don't really think about how you're handling a book until someone points it out. Like you're holding it this way, or maybe you're licking your finger or something like that. You just kind of automatically do it. And it is something that is learned behavior, as you mentioned, from seeing other people do this stuff. But it's not something that I don't know that I think about until someone points it out. You're holding your book weird, or you're holding it this way, or something that happens to me all the time because I'm constantly dehydrated, even though I'm having water all the time, is I have lip balm on all the time. And I always get it on the edge of my page. And I keep thinking like someone's going to find this book in 100 years and know that I put my fingerprint there in lip balm, even though, well, hopefully the book is still around because most of them are paper, not parchment. No. One of my favorite examples that you have, it's kind of relevant to this, is people touching their finger to their mouth, so kissing their finger and then touching the image. And I think you had one where it was a picture of Christ's ascension and the priest was like tracing it so there's a smear, as if he's trying to like comic book Jesus up into the sky with his finger. I just thought that was so cute.
Yes, I want to talk about that, but my inner curator or my book conservator that lives inside me is screaming, before you kiss your diptych, always remove your lipstick. Very important.
It's good advice.
But yes, good advice. But yes, so this idea of touching the finger with the tongue, so which I call wet touching. And I think there's a lot of wet touching that occurs in manuscripts where the person isn't necessarily bringing the book up to the face to kiss it with the lips, but is transferring the kiss from the lips to the book through the vehicle of the now wet finger. And we can see the results of this where there are fingerprints of the whorl. You can see the whorls of the fingerprint that have been imprinted on the manuscript. And especially where somebody with a slightly wet finger has touched something that's gold, and that something that is gold has been outlined in black. And that black, where it overlaps the gold, doesn't adhere very well. And so it's quite fugitive and it comes off on the wet finger. And then we can get a rather perfect fingerprint of it. But it helps to visualize what's really happening, this kissing of the finger. But I think that the kissing of the finger and touching of images again takes place because of several different motivations. And the one you mentioned about the Pentecost is, I see this over and over again. Like once you see this, you'll see it everywhere, that people take their finger and then trace the descent of the Holy Spirit, which is often at the top of the image, top of the frame, in a burst of light or carried by a dove, and then trace that trajectory down into the ears, into the faces of the apostles down below. And I'm sure that listeners, once they hear this, that they will find hundreds of examples of this. And it's about, I think, really interacting with the story and saying, yeah, I get it. Here is the Holy Spirit, and I'm going to help that Holy Spirit go right into the ear of that listener. And so it's about participating in the narrative. Or we see other examples of that in contexts where a prolector, that is a professional reader of the kind who read at court as a form of kind of moralizing entertainment, might be reading a book of, say, Quansi's Miracles, for example. And those often have big images. And the example that's in The Hague is one that I've studied quite a bit. And you can see that many of the images are smeared, but in a very targeted way, where the prolector, I think, is taking his finger and then acting out the action in order to draw in the attention of the audience and saying, here is where the person drops the baby into the toilet. And here is where the virgin catches the baby before it hits the bottom of the toilet water. And here is where the devil is defenestrating the baby. Lots of baby images in these. But in every case where the prolector is crossing out the hands of the person who's doing the evil deed in order to draw the audience's attention in, but also to act out the narrative again. And so it's a little like when you have a PowerPoint image up in a public lecture and you lean over with your hand and you point something out. So it's sort of medieval PowerPoint in a way. It's a way of drawing the audience in.
Yeah, and I was thinking it's also for teaching, right? These images that come along with these holy texts are for teaching too. And when you look at a picture book with a kid, you're often saying, oh, and then like the lion goes over here, tracing it with your finger. So it's not just for a priest by himself, like cartooning this ascension of Jesus or something like that. It is a public demonstration of what's happening. And I think that it's beautiful to see these things working together. Something that might be a little bit more private that I do want to mention before we have to go is obituary images, because I think those are right at the end of volume 1. And they're really interesting the way people have touched these images that were created of people who are recently deceased. So can you tell us a little bit about how people would touch those images?
Yes. So in a particular manuscript, the Grand Obituary of Notre Dame, so the cathedral in Paris that burned recently, the obituary manuscript from that church survives in the BNF. And it's fascinating because it was built over time. So as people die, their obituaries are added to it. But if it's somebody really important, they might have an entire folio with their image commissioned alongside a list of all of the donations that they've made to the church, that can be celebrated in perpetuity. And that these obituaries would then be read annually on their date of death. And what's interesting about those is that for the ones that have an added image, that oftentimes the image is really smeared, as if the book were being used during the living memory of that person. And the survivors of that person have come along to the first 10 years of the memorial and are invited somehow to reach their hands in and to touch the effigy of the deceased person. And it's a bit of a popularity contest. We can see like some of these people are really smeared and they are, highly loved, and other people are quite ignored. But it seems as if a lot of people are reaching in with a wet finger as like one last way to touch the deceased before the mass ends, before the book closes, before the remembrance of their loved one's death is then closed for the year. So that is a hypothesis, and it's a bit hard to test, but I think that it partly explains why in books of hours we see the same kind of gesture, that in dozens or possibly even hundreds of books of hours where the Vigil of the Dead is prefaced by an image of a funeral service, that you will often see the coffin, the draped coffin, has been wet touched. And that draped coffin is often blue, and you can see a big glob of blue paint on the facing page. Usually the text folio, the opening, the incipit of the Vigil of the Dead has this big glob of blue paint because the person who is reading it on behalf of their dead loved one has touched the coffin. And that coffin could stand for anybody, but in this case, it stands for, the person they have in mind as they're reading for this annual mass.
It just goes to show that there are so many ways people are interacting with these books. Some it's very ritualized, some it's for swearing, some it's for just a sentimental reaching out to somebody who has been lost. I just think that it's just so beautiful. And I love that you have somebody who is looking at the dirt and grime and fingerprints and seeing the people behind that. So that is awesome. I do want to ask you before we get going, what is the weirdest thing you came across in a manuscript? You've looked at hundreds, if not thousands. Is there something that jumps out that you tell at every party?
The weirdest thing. Oh my gosh, where to begin? Well, I think that the weirdest manuscript is probably Philip the Good's prayer book, where he sewed a half a dozen images of the face of Christ, of Veronica's, into the book, and then proceeded to kiss them so vigorously that the white backgrounds of Veronica's towel is, in several cases, it looks like, a towel that's been just dragged through the mud. And then on top of that, they're scraped in a very particular way. And I've hypothesized that they've been scraped so that the face of Christ can be collected and then administered as a kind of medicine. And once I had that idea, I found dozens of others. So I'm hoping that listeners will find interesting examples of scraped Veronicas and say, oh, wow, here's another one where the paint has been scraped. And I think that that's also why Veronicas are painted with super thick paint on very thick parchment so that they'll be durable. And then they have the aesthetic of, a scratch lottery card. You can get under the paint layer with your finger. And that's part of the point. That's how to enact the functionality of that object.
Well, that is very cool. And it wasn't in the book, so I'm glad that you mentioned it. But one thing that was in the book that you've just mentioned, you have a coda saying, everyone, now that you know some stuff about manuscripts and how they can be beautiful and grubby, everyone should go and look at the closest medieval manuscript to wherever you live. And there are a lot in major cities. People can go and find them. And usually you can get access to them for free if you ask nicely. And then you said, email me and tell me what you found. So you're still inviting people to email you and tell you what they found in manuscripts.
I may live to regret it, but yes, I hope that people take a picture with your phone and send it to me. I'd love to see it. I'd love to see what you find. And go to your local library. There are lots of libraries across the US, even in Scotland, we have little repositories. There are 3 or 4 manuscripts in the Perth Kirk, for example, lots in Glasgow, tons in Edinburgh, a few in St. Andrews. But if you're in the French countryside, those are some of the best libraries, the municipal libraries across France. Go look at manuscripts and have a great lunch afterwards. Germany is a terrific place to go. Manuscript truffle hounding as well. And you'll find lots of ignored, filthy, fabulous things.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Kate, for coming on and talking to us about dirty books. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Danielle. It's been great. Bye-bye.
To find out more about Kate's work, you can visit her faculty page at the University of St. Andrews. Her new book is Touching Parchment, How Medieval Users Rubbed, Handled, and Kissed Their Manuscripts, Volume 1, Officials and Their Books, which you can read for free at openbookpublishers.com. Volume 2, Social Encounters with the Book, will be available soon. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey. Well, we do a kind of a series called New Medieval Books where we feature what's been recently published and interested medievalists. And I wanted to highlight one that we just did. It's called Africanism, Blacks in a Medieval Arab Imaginary by Nadir Kadim. And it was originally published in 2004, but it was done in Arabic and it was only translated last year through McGill Queen's University Press. And it was a real eye-opener for me reading through it, how Arab depictions of Black people in medieval literature was like. And what it revealed was like this ingrained racism that you really even see today. A lot of the same stereotypes that are appearing in the 9th century have continued on today here in North America. So I thought it was a real eye-opening and groundbreaking book, and I just wanted to highlight that.
Great. Give us the title again so we can check it out.
It's called Africanism, Blacks in a Medieval Arab Imaginary. Nadir Kadem is the author. So check that out if you haven't.
Great. And you've done a post on that on medievalist.net?
Yeah, every time we do these new medieval books, we add a little excerpt from it. I found a YouTube video of him being interviewed about the book as well. So this is something that you might want to read.
Awesome. We'll have to check that out. Thanks, Peter.
We also have a piece about Joan of Arc, and it's been counted that she actually traveled 3,000 miles on horseback.
That is a lot, considering she's just a teenager.
Yeah. I know, just a couple of years. And yeah, the numbers add up, going from place to place. And a really kind of fascinating article about what that tells us about Joan. For her abilities, her physical abilities, and even in martial abilities. So we have a piece on that. Plus, we also have information about Warwick Castle is now opening a medieval-style hotel this summer.
Oh, man.
On its grounds. So
that sounds amazing.
it's going to have rooms that are War of the Roses themed.
Of course, yes.
And there are talking paintings in the main hall.
Wow.
So it's an animatronics.
That is so cool.
I've never been to Warwick Castle. It's one of the grand medieval castles. It's privately owned. And I get the feeling that this is a place for families to go, which when we say families, we mean kids. Would you want to go to Warwick?
Yeah. I mean, I want to visit all the castles. I haven't been there yet, but I mean, now I have to go and check out the talking paintings next time I'm there.
There's an animatronic horse and rider going through the main hall.
That's cool.
Hopefully no one will get hurt.
It's not Westworld, Peter. Well, we'll have to check that out. Maybe next time you're in England, you can go and do an expose on how this all works. People can check it out.
Warwick Castle people, invite me there, please.
There you go. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us all of this stuff and how it's on medievalist.net. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. To get in on all the action and support your favorite medievalists, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from books to cooks, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN-Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.